Welcome to the ITV election interviews. Right, what have the Scottish National Party got to offer? Let's take a quick look.
Our job is to deliver independence.
Nicola Sturgeon's led the Scottish National Party for 5 years. The SNP was the third biggest party in the last Parliament, with 35 MPs out of 59 in Scotland. As their name suggests, their main priority is Scotland becoming an independent country. And to do so, they want a second referendum. But for that to be legally binding, it requires permission from Westminster. If neither the Tories nor Labour win enough seats to form a government, they'll need support from the other parties. Nicola Sturgeon has ruled out supporting Boris Johnson, but she says she'd be willing to back Labour if they get a second independence vote next year. Beyond independence, the party is anti-austerity, anti-Brexit, and they say they want to protect the NHS from privatisation. Nicola Sturgeon, let's start with your pitch. Why should people in Scotland vote for you?
Well, people in Scotland should vote SNP, firstly, to deprive Boris Johnson of the majority he craves, to make sure he doesn't have a free hand to do exactly what he wants to do. They should vote SNP to escape the chaos of Brexit, and fundamentally vote SNP to secure the right to choose our own future, so that Scotland's future, the kind of country we are and will become, isn't determined by Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn or a broken Westminster system, but is instead in our own hands so that we can choose that future ourselves.
Boris Johnson said in tonight's debate earlier that the SNP has already done a coalition deal with Labour. Jeremy Corbyn in response said there's no deal and no deal to be done. Given you are key to what those two were saying, which is it?
Well, no deal has been done, that much is true, but I've been very clear. I would never put Boris Johnson or, in fact, any Tory into Downing Street. I've seen the damage that Tory governments do to communities the length and breadth of Scotland and indeed the UK. I would want, if the arithmetic allowed this, to be part of a progressive alternative to the Conservatives. And I've made very clear that if Labour were in a position to form a minority government, then, of course, we would look to see the kind of issues that we wanted to pursue. I don't want to be in a coalition. I've made very clear I don't foresee a coalition, but a more informal arrangement is something I wouldn't rule out. And, of course, I lead a minority government in Scotland right now, so I know very well that a party in that position would need support from other parties. But crucial for me, of course, would be an acceptance that Scotland's future was up to the people of Scotland to decide, and that Westminster didn't have a veto over that.
And your timescale for that, just to clarify, is wanting a second independence referendum next year in 2020?
Yes.
And tonight?
Yes, and the reason for that is pretty straightforward, because Scotland is at a crossroads, the whole of the UK is at a crossroads, and we need to be able to determine which path we want to take. And the choice is very stark. Either we are taken down a path by Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn or whatever Westminster politician is in Downing Street, a path that we haven't chosen. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU, or we decide ourselves what kind of country we want to be. So that decision is fundamental, and I believe an independent Scotland could be a much fairer, more equal, more prosperous country. And of course, we could sit at the top table in the European Union, wielding the kind of influence that we've all watched Ireland wield over the past 3 years.
I want to just get back to the issue of timescale, though, because if you're wanting this independence referendum next year, Jeremy Corbyn has once again tonight ruled out you getting a second independence referendum in the early years of a Labour government. So does that rule out you giving him support, any kind of support, if he had a minority government?
Well, let me deal with that head on. But firstly, I think I have to say that Jeremy Corbyn's position on this does change almost every day. It's almost impossible to keep up with it. But there is an issue of principle at stake here that I would expect any Westminster leader looking to the SNP for support to accept. And that principle is this, that of course there's a difference of opinion in Scotland about whether or not we should be independent, but it is up to the people of Scotland to decide that question. It's up to the people of Scotland through its elected Scottish Parliament to decide if there is another independence referendum and also what timescale that should happen on. It's not for Westminster to dictate that. So it's that issue of principle that is crucial. Of course, I would want to see a Labour government do other things as well, bring about a definitive end to austerity, an end to welfare cuts, look to take a very different approach than the Tories to migration, to absolutely protect our NHS from trade deals and privatisation. So I drive a hard bargain, and first and foremost, I would want to make sure that Scotland's voice and Scotland's interests were heard and protected in a way that they simply haven't been at Westminster over these past few years.
All right, Nicola Sturgeon, what happens if Labour does come into power on December the 13th and they do indeed get a second new deal with the EU? The country goes to a second referendum on the EU, Remain wins, Scotland remains in the EU. Does that cancel your rationale, your reasoning, your material change for wanting a second independence referendum for Scotland?
No, it doesn't. And the proposition that I'm putting to people in Scotland in this election is this. We have seen over the past 3 years, and Brexit is simply the illustration of this, that right now our future is not in our own hands. And Westminster governments can decide to impose a direction of travel and upon us and policies that we don't want upon us. And therefore, that really illustrates the importance of Scotland deciding for ourselves what kind of country we want to be. And, you know, that question of, are we going to continue to, you know, have Westminster elections where we cross our fingers and hope for, you know, the devil rather than the deep blue sea? We simply hope that Westminster governments don't impose austerity or Brexit or any other policies that we don't choose upon us, or is it time to take that future into our own hands? That's the kind of crossroads moment Scotland is at, and it has real implications for our public services, for our economy, for the prospects of future generations. Scotland's one of the wealthiest countries on the face of the planet. We've got natural and human resources that other countries only dream of. And the question is, how do we maximise that potential as a country? And I believe that's as an independent country, but fundamentally, I believe that it must be for people in Scotland, not Westminster, to decide the direction we take.
If someone was coming fresh to the British political landscape right now, could you explain to them why you fight so hard to stay in one union and fight so hard to leave another?
Well, you know, on the face of it, that's a good question, but I don't think you have to stop and think for too long to realise how absurd a question it is. If you went to France or Germany or Spain or Portugal and suggested to them that their membership of the European Union meant that they weren't independent countries, they would probably look at you rather askance. All of these countries are independent, but they cooperate and collaborate, pool sovereignty where it makes sense in the European Union. The position of Scotland in the Westminster system right now is very different to member states within the European Union. Ireland's been the perfect example of that. During the whole Brexit saga, Ireland's had support and solidarity from its European partners. Scotland's been treated with utter contempt by the Westminster Parliament. Our views have been ignored. So Ireland's demonstrated the power and influence that small countries can have within the European Union, and an independent Scotland would be there as an independent, equal member. Of course, we'd always be working with and cooperating with our friends across the British Isles, but we'd also be there at the top tables in Europe, participating in the single market, the world's biggest single market, 8 times the size of the UK. That's what I think is the best of both worlds for Scotland.
All right, let's move on to your quick-fire questions, Nicola Sturgeon, if I may. First of all, would President Trump be welcome in an independent Scotland?
Well, I can't stop him coming to Scotland. I'm no fan of President Trump. As First Minister, I have said that I would, of course, not refuse to meet with him, but I'd be pretty clear with him about the many things I disagree with him on, as I'm sure he would be with me in return.
Would you be OK with a hard border between Scotland and England?
No, it's not my policy, it's not my objective, it's not my desire, it's not my policy that threatens borders. As we've seen, it's the policy of Brexit that threatens borders, which is why I will always argue for the UK to consider again the Brexit position and for the UK to remain within the single market and customs union.
If I can push you for a short answer, a one-word answer on the next one, please. Aside from independence, what's your #1 priority?
Domestically, I've prioritised education, but I think in this election, climate change has to be the big priority for all politicians. I know that wasn't one word, but I tried to keep it short.
Thank you for trying. Would Scotland replace the pound with the euro one day?
No, I don't think it would.
OK. What about if the UK did vote to leave and then you were in a situation where Scotland got its independence and then you rejoined the EU, you would be forced somewhere down the road to take the euro, wouldn't you?
No, we wouldn't. And there are examples in the European Union today that prove that's not the case. Sweden, for example, joined the EU after the so-called requirements to join the euro were in place. It's not in the euro, has no intentions of going into the euro. Jean-Claude Juncker, I think, is on record as saying that the EU cannot force any country into the euro against its will.
Scotland has the worst deficit in the EU right now. Would the rest of the UK be worse or better off if Scotland did gain independence?
Well, Scotland's deficit is falling. First of all, our revenues are rising. But if that argument is true, and we don't have time to go into it in detail, but if that argument is true and Scotland does have, to use your term, the worst deficit, as we are governed by Westminster, then that's a big argument for change for Scotland. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So that says to me that we should do things differently, not do things the same. More generally, I think independence for Scotland would be good for Scotland, but good for the rest of the UK, because all of the countries of the UK would then participate and deal with each other on the basis of equality. We'll always be each other's closest friends, but we would do that on the basis of equality.
We saw a radical policy from Jeremy Corbyn earlier in the week, this talk of part nationalising BT to get broadband to all homes. Is that a radical policy that you would support if you did end up in some circumstances working with him?
Well, I'd want to see the detail of it. In principle, I think it sounds interesting. But of course, in Scotland, where we have some responsibility for these matters already, we're already in the process of delivering superfast broadband to every domestic and commercial premise across the country. We're about to sign contracts to do that. So we're ahead of the game there, as we are in so many other things. Actually, if you look at Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto, from free prescriptions to free personal care, free tuition, these are things the SNP government in Scotland is already delivering, which is why you don't need to vote Labour in Scotland, because the SNP is already doing most of the things that they commit to.